is tape number 404, August the 31st, 1978. It's side 1, and it's Mae Brussell. This tape is made in Carmel, California. This is part 3 of a series of chronological events, some important events of the past that have shaped our future. If there's no earth-shaking news, and if you want me to continue with this chronology, I will in September, and I can go on to part 4 possibly and part 5 and complete it up to the present date. If you want me to take a breather and get back to it later and update the current news, I'll do that. So write and tell me what you want me to do, and we can continue the series, or we can put it aside and get it back in a few more months. If there's no earth-shaking news in the interim, I can continue. If you want me to update the news, I can. The tape that was made last week, number 403, left off with 1941, with what was going on in the world in 1941 in terms of events that are affecting what I consider our present and our future now. I want to pick up right there with 1941. That was the year that the wearing of the Jewish star was decreed in all the Baltic countries, where they had conquered those countries, and Auschwitz was experimenting and proceeding with its gassing of persons, and that was the time when the Pope, the present John Paul II, was working at Auschwitz for I.G. Farben, the Solvay chemical company that was making the gas for the exterminations. October of 41, 34,000 were killed in Odessa. In October of 41, 34,000 were killed in Kiev, another 15,000 in Rovno, and then the Pearl Harbor attack. We had talked last week about the Pearl Harbor attack and the forewarning of that took place in 1941, and the United States had ample time to know about it and stop it, but we allowed it to proceed. 1942 was an important year because by September of 1942, Hitler had realized that he had erred in Stalingrad, and similar to Napoleon or other persons who thought they could conquer Russia, he couldn't make it in Stalingrad. And that was an important date because September the 7th is when the turning point took place in that city. November, just 3 months later, in 1942, Heinrich Himmler met alone with Martin Bormann. This is another important meeting. Martin Bormann had succeeded Hess, who had flown over to England to tell the British that they were going to try to take Russia and get off England's back for a while, and Hess was still in prison in England at the time, and Martin Bormann, who took his place, met with Himmler, and they discussed the possibility that all their dreams were going to go down the drain. If they couldn't take Stalingrad, they would have to make other plans. And then Martin Bormann set up the Bormann Brotherhood all over the world, and as early as September of 1942, the Nazis knew that they had to go underground. By May 16th, the 1 year later, May 16th, or 7 months later than this one meeting, was the date in 1943 when all the top organizations of the Gestapo were to change their names, and members of the Gestapo were to flee to other countries or resign from the Gestapo to show that they were in disapproval of Adolf Hitler and didn't like his regime, so that when the war was over they would be selected to build up Europe again because they did not like Adolf Hitler. That was a facade that was put on because of the knowledge that if they couldn't take Stalingrad, they couldn't win the war. In 1942 was the murder of Admiral Darlan. I talked about that several weeks ago on a tape. It was an attempt by the monarchy, the Count of Paris, to get rid of Darlan and put the monarchy back in France. 1942 was when the Nazis had their meeting on the final solution of the Jewish question. Given X amount of years and not knowing when the war was over, they would have to step up the death camps at Treblinka and get rid of the Jews of Nazi-occupied France and Holland, and 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto were sent to Treblinka. The Flying Tigers was active, that organization with Madame Chenault over in the Asian confrontation. It later became known during the Vietnamese War as a CIA airplane that was involved with narcotics, with organized crime in the United States, and the drug traffic in Southeast Asia. It was building up the control that Madame Chenault would gain, and later she was instrumental in 1968 of breaking the D'Entente peace conference that even Lyndon Johnson wanted. Madame Chenault, later linked with the Flying Tigers, was instrumental in breaking that peace talk, just as Lee Harvey Oswald and Gary Powers and the CIA had stopped the D'Entente and the peace talk earlier of Premier Khrushchev and President Eisenhower. Madame Chenault has a restaurant in Washington, D.C., and it's co-owned by Jack Anderson, who has worked for 20 years with Frank Sturgis, one of the Watergate defendants, and the Central Intelligence Agency, and has been fed information by American spies inside the government that feed him with documentation. I always thought that Jack Anderson was part of the Mormon Mafia in Washington, D.C., and it's an interesting connection to work with somebody like Madame Chenault, so heavily linked to narcotics. The Mormons don't take coffee, are not supposed to have coffee, are not supposed to have cigarettes or caffeine, but dope dealing seems to be all right, or working with dope dealers seems to be all right. There's a lot of contradictions in our society, and that seems to be one of them in my mind. In 1943, the Nazis were escalating the killings in the extermination camps and rounding up the Jews from all over Europe. They surrendered at Stalingrad. The official surrender was February the 2nd in 43, and they were liquidating, as I say, these ghettos all over Poland. October the 20th, the United Nations established their War Crimes Commission. I don't know that it's done much good. It's hard to tell. In 1943, LSD was discovered by Albert Hoffman. He played a big role with Allen Dulles and then bringing it to this country and applying it to the anti-war protesters during the Vietnam War. Perón took power in Argentina, and in 1943, an important day, as I say, in May of 43, the important meeting to decide that they would organize their German cells all over the world, and that is what we're feeling today. These are the assassination squads, the hit squads. Money, jewels, paintings, and so forth were sent to Argentina and to Shanghai, and they were in Manchuria and Hong Kong and South America and Brazil and the Latin American countries, and they were getting ready, if they had to surrender, that they'd have their loot and they would be protected. And this meeting in 43 was an important one in May of Himmler and the top Nazis. April the 14th, 1943, Mr. Aristotle Onassis has come home from Argentina. He has oil tankers. He's become a millionaire and very respectable. According to the Gemstone file and other information, his fortune was built up before oil on hashish and narcotics that was shipped back and forth. And he was working with these Nazis that had set up their headquarters as early as the early 40s down in South America, Mexico, Uruguay, Paraguay, and so forth. And he comes back to meet and marry the daughter of another Greek ship tanker who's to become a multimillionaire, the daughter of Stavros Livanos. He met Tina at the Plaza Hotel in New York. 17 years later, Robert Mayu would be at the same Plaza Hotel meeting members of organized crime and making arrangements for the CIA to build up their assassination teams. In 1944, there was a story that gold was missing from the Federal Reserves. This was an important date because from that time on, there were rumors that it was being sold overseas and that our gold was being depleted from this country. Paris was free by 1944. In September of 44, they were freed, and in 1944, Hitler had sent to Argentina $400 million to fund for the next Reich. When the American troops and British troops and Russian went into Germany, the banks were totally emptied and there wasn't any money there. The Book of Records calls it the biggest bank robbery in the world. There was no more money, and this 400 million alone was sent down to Argentina in 1944. The fighting war wasn't over until May of 45, and in 44 to Auschwitz from Hungary were sent 476,000 Jews, and the D-Day invasion came June 6th, where the United States armies landed in Normandy, France, and then Heinrich Himmler, by November, was ordered to destroy the concentration camps and not leave any traces of their atrocities. The reason I dwell so much in the historical events on the atrocities is that as soon as the war is over, the same Nazis were incorporated into our OSS and then formed the CIA, and that's why I dwell on it, because the Americans and the Vatican and England and all the countries and all the leaders of the world knew it was going on, and they hurried through the Nuremberg Tribunal, which we'll talk about, and then put them all back into business and sent them to our universities and institutions and defense industry and into our military system, and that's why World War II was never really over. In 1945, Hitler set up what he called his wolf clubs. He had 30,000 Liebers born. Those were children born and given women that raised mass children. They had homes and farms for them, like a huge cantaloupe field. I've seen movies of all these little heads. The Liebers born now are 34 years old, and those were children of the Reich. I never read much about this Dr. Schacht, who handed out the cyanide, or his background, or whether those were his parents in Texas, Houston, Texas, or a Mr. Schmidt, who's a lawyer for Dan White in San Francisco. It'd be interesting to ever find out, but I'm sure it's impossible. But many 34-year-olds all over the world, they're 34 years old, there were a minimum of 30 to 40,000. One of the clubs that was formed was the werewolves, the Nazi werewolves. And I know one of the men is in the Carmel Peninsula here, who is a member of Hitler's werewolf. He's German, of course, and his mother brought him to this country, and he works for the Bechtel Corporation and the CIA under the guise of something so far removed from it you wouldn't know to see him that what his profession is and his links, but I know him very well. There was an article in 1971 about a man named Rolf Steiner, a German soldier, and he was arrested. He was a mercenary in Israel, and he said he worked for the CIA. Steiner was 41 years old at the time, and he said his military career began in 1945 as a member of the Nazi Wolf Clubs. They were the home guard made up of Hitler Youth, and since that time he has been working with the CIA, and he was accused of murdering somebody, and the trial was going on. A 7-month-old child was murdered by him in a rebel camp. So he's been working as a mercenary, first as Hitler's killer, and then sent to Black Africa, and has been stationed with the French Foreign Legion in Indochina, Korea, Algeria, and Suez, continue in Israel, Uganda, working first for Hitler and then for the CIA. So the formation of these Liebersborn that are turned loose in the world, and also the werewolf, the young Hitler's youth, are not gone and faded away, but they're picked up once in a while, an occasional murder trial. May the 9th, 1945, Hitler surrendered to the Russians. We can't forget that date. Germany collapsed, and Interpol then moved to France, away from Berlin to France. 1945 was the year that James Forrestal jumped out of a window at Bethesda Hospital and was the victim of one of the first mind control experiments of the new LSD that had been around now for 2 years. Forrestal was against the Central Intelligence Agency. They were getting it formed together, although the National Security Act, the group didn't get formed and into law until 1947, but he believed that each branch, Navy intelligence and Army and Air Force, should have their own intelligence instead of lumped into one group. And he was put into Bethesda and went out that window. Hitler escaped on a U-2 boat U-530 and a companion boat U-977, 4:15 in the afternoon, April 30th, 1945. Many of you don't believe that, but that's the U-2 boat that went down to Argentina. There was a whole cruise that went down. Martin Bormann then escaped with his passports from the Vatican. and soon Werner von Braun was to come to the United States. Mussolini was hung by the heels in Italy. We saw him dead. The bunker of Hitler's wasn't opened for quite a long while afterwards. Martha Mitchell at that time was working in chemical warfare service in Washington, D.C. She had graduated from college at the University of Miami that year and was dating B.B. Rebozo. April 23, 1945 is when Franklin Roosevelt died. Nobody saw the coffin, and it was a time in April, just before the surrender of Europe, when Allen Dulles was making a deal with the Nazis and trying to make a separate peace, and Roosevelt promised he never would do it because he had told the Russians he would stay firm. I mentioned that on another tape, but I'm throwing it in its chronological order. Nobody saw the open coffin of Franklin Roosevelt, and several days after he said no to Dulles and the arrangements to a separate peace with Italy and Germany, he died. That was April 23rd. Eisenhower came home July 2nd, and then the story of Hitler's cremation came out July 23rd. The man who brought it out was Hugh Trevor Roper of British intelligence, who as yet hadn't been in the bunker, and then he went on later to write the introduction to Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment. Mark then was linked to the South African Chilean connection to Jonestown, and the attorney for Jim Jones of the Central Intelligence Agency, a victim of the mind control experimentations. Mark was working with Hugh Trevor Roper. Later, in 1945, is when the bunker was opened, and Roper was the first person to write about it. He was the original historian, such as William Manchester was on the Kennedy assassination, or Robert Blair Kaiser was on Robert Kennedy's assassination. There's a historian in residence that comes up with the quick, easy answers and then leaves all the other loose ends dangling for history. Japan surrendered August the 20th. I want to get this chronology right because after Germany surrendered, and this was important, May 1945, Germany surrendered, and in August 5th, 4 months later, atomic bombs made by the Nazis, and this is in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., were handed over to the United States to drop quickly in Japan as excuse to end the Japanese War before Russia got into the Pacific Ocean, because when it was over in the Pacific, we wanted to control the oil, the narcotics traffic, and the Pacific Ocean. And if Russia went as far on the West Coast, their East Coast it was, or our West Coast, they would have a control similar to what they have behind the Iron Curtain on the continent of Europe. So quickly, to get the Nazis back to this country to fight the Soviets and get on with that war, the atomic bombs were given to the United States and dropped August the 5th at Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki, and the Japanese said, we'll give up August the 20th. And although Russia declared war on Japan, it was all over, and they never really got a foothold in the Southeast Asia or Asia. We sacrificed 2 cities and a few workers, and gained by keeping their hands off of the Pacific Ocean. And then the Russian jewels of the monarchy and the Tsar and the goods that had been sent to Harbin that Japan had in Manchuria were put on a boat and shipped outside of Hong Kong, and they're still waiting there, billions of dollars of gold and jewels that they didn't want the Russians to get. If the Russians went east to Manchuria, they would have their hands on these goodies also. So it was necessary to put them on Red Cross hospital ships and drop the ship outside of Hong Kong, a safe distance from Hong Kong, and kill the patients and crew under the guise that it was a hospital ship to hold on to all this wealth that was quickly taken out of Manchuria to keep it from the Soviet Union. The United States was getting nervous about whether China, that huge landmass, could fall the way that Russia did, because Chiang Kai-shek was another corrupt fascist dope dealer. So in 1945 to 1949, we sent China, Harry Truman sent him $3 billion to build up their war chest and hold on the best they could, because China also was ready to collapse. Reinhard Gehlen, I've mentioned many times on the tapes, the man who began secretly rearming Germany with its intelligence system in 1920, is now going to be brought to the United States dressed as a general in full regalia. Has written documents that are in history books in Germany of his intent, also written up in the book Gehlen, Spy of the Century, the plans of eliminating people by starvation in the Ukraine. 40 million immediately were going to be starved to death and 50 million subhuman. The legacy that Gehlen gives us now can be found in a book like Project Paperclip or in Gerard O'Neill's plans for future space colonies, where they can, in fact, with laser beams burn down and scorch the earth and kill off by famine 40 million. Every 2 years they could take 10 million people and rid the earth systematically of people. And also our educational standards are going lower, 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 so that people are becoming subhuman in education and are literally trained for not very much, but slave labor. Only a certain elite class is getting a special education, and the rest are put aside. In 1945, a group was called the Kill or Be Killed organization. It had a name. It was formed in Augsburg, Germany. Hugh MacDonald, who wrote a book on the Kennedy assassination, described in his book The Hour of the Blue Fox his experience as an Army officer. Hugh MacDonald worked for the Los Angeles Police Department, for Sheriff Peter Pitches, for the FBI, the CIA, and Howard Hughes. And he said that there was, in 1945, a sense of the incongruity of America ever working with the Soviet Union. Therefore, an organization was formed of nationals from several nations. MacDonald went on to be a bodyguard for Barry Goldwater, but he was president and knew about a group in 1945 that was formed. The Bormann Brotherhood was spreading all over the world, and all over Europe and in the United States, organizations were formed to get into the Soviet Union and break it up. In 1945, Project Paperclip was begun. Those of you who take the tapes regularly know about that, the book called Project Paperclip, and you know what they were doing. The plan was to build satellites and space stations and rocket development to control the world, to have large reflectors, to focus rays, to set fires. They could even boil the world, to have weapons to rule the world, and this was the goal. And scientists were sent all over the United States to Aberdeen Proving Ground for their rocket research, and 642 scientists were sent to the universities, the hospitals, UCLA, Stanford Medical, Stanford Research, Tulane University, Louisiana, you name it, Princeton, Yale, Harvard. They were sent over for this purpose from Germany the minute the war was over. In May, the Project Paperclip began to bring them here, and May is when Hitler surrendered. But the plans had been brewing with Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles since 1943, so they quickly could get these people out before the Soviet Union picked them up as war criminals, and we could place them in strategic jobs all over the United States. And again, I came to Project Paperclip through reading about Walter Dornberger, the Nazi war criminal, who hired Michael Paine, the man whose home Lee Harvey Oswald stayed and where his wife lived. So the minute the war was over with the Soviet Union, we split up with our allies. Imperialism was supposed to be over. The land masses were up for grabs. There was Asia, there was the Middle East, Africa, South America. The same people that funded Hitler, funded Mussolini, hate blacks, hate Jews, hate Indians and Arabs and Chinese and Asians, had only one juicy solution. Bring the Nazis here, rearm Germany, and they were brought down to the Bahamas. The headquarters, one of them was in Tyrol Bay in Jamaica, and Tyrol in Germany was where many of the secret meetings were held when Hitler was still in power. The purpose, in quotes, contained communism as described from one book that I have, and in other terms, control resources, labor, and energy. Now, when World War II was over, the means of control are communications, space satellites, propaganda. Communications, ITT was one of the conduits, American corporation that was building for the Luftwaffe, the Air Force in Germany, Nazi Germany, They were given repatriation money and resettled here. The Hughes Aerospace began to boom. In 1945, as soon as the war was over, the aerospace business was in, and the aerospace men in California met and selected Richard Nixon from Navy intelligence to run for Congress in California against Jerry Voorhees. Richard Nixon had applied to go to the FBI when he was out of law school. He went into the Navy, and then the aerospace industries had sent him to Long Island, where he was working in bringing in the Project Paperclip people, then was sent out to California, where he met Herman Perry of Bank of America and Howard Hughes, and they ran him for Congress from California in that time period of 1946, when these people were all being brought to this country. The aerospace would control the space satellites. J. Walter Thompson became one of the forerunners of the propaganda. They not only sold Disneyland and Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola or floor wax, Johnson's wax, but it was a method of controlling politicians and the Cold War. And as I mentioned earlier on one of these preceding tapes, the vice president of J. Walter Thompson went on to advise Nelson Rockefeller and the Ford Foundation. And when you read the book of the OSS, it was set up by one of the persons from J. Walter Thompson. The rearming of the United States would be identical to what happened in Germany from 1920 to 1945. It would be illegal and secret, clandestine. Allen Dulles, who brought over Reinhard Gehlen, would become the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The ITT had the Gestapo files in their secret islands and headquarters down in the Bahamas, where John Conley also has headquarters with Max and Gally Clark, friends of Lee Harvey Oswald's, down in Tyrol Bay. So Project Paperclip brought over all of these people to get ready for their muscles. They moved into the southern states. As I began this tape 2 tapes ago on chronology with the Civil War, the South was ripe for the scientists and experts from Paperclip. No noticeable industry had built up. When a man is unemployed in the South, he goes into the Army. A lot of big Army bases all through the South. Munitions factories built up. Warfare hardware was essential. Atomic weapons were essential. We had the Tennessee Valley and Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and Houston, the Space Center, and Cape Canaveral, and out in California, Hughes Aircraft. The Hughes Tool Company was still drilling. 80% of the oil drilling profits were made by the tool bit by Howard Hughes. Now Howard was really going to escalate the Hughes Aircraft and help with this great project against the commies in the Soviet Union and put all of his energy into this project. The Defense Industry Security Command was formed along with Division 5 of the FBI. It was a natural, because to guard the weapons and the atomic bases and the F-111s and the B-52s and all the rockets and missiles, they needed to clear the people working there to make sure that there was no sabotage or counterintelligence. And the way they cleared was through previous FBI files of J. Edgar Hoover, who also worked with Adolf Hitler's Interpol as vice president of Interpol in 1946 when this was going on. So they would know who had the kosher seal of approval and who couldn't work there. And William Sullivan, for domestic counterintelligence through the Division 5 of FBI, was a liaison between the Defense Industry Security Command that was guarding these new installations and Air Force factories that were to go up and then be escalating the war soon in Korea and then in Southeast Asia. And now we're going for the Middle East. These warfare factories had to be guarded, and it was within that milieu that the assassination teams were set up down in Mexico of the world's best trained assassins, so that in the event that anybody became the head of state of any government that didn't go along with this orderly progression of fascism, not democracy or electoral opportunities, but total fascism, they could be killed. And that's when the assassination teams began to kill heads of states all over the world, and the killing of John Kennedy was just one that fit into the total pattern of the assassination teams. We'll continue with this on the other side, on the chronology of what happened to the United States when the war was over in 1945. Tape number 404, side 2, dated August the 31st. Continent of Europe does not really explain the situation completely, because we separate the blood and the pain from the numbers. 56 million perished in Europe and Asia. Another 80 million were displaced or injured or separated from their families. 20 million Soviet citizens died in that war, 20 million, and they held the battle at Stalingrad. They held it strong, and they won what they felt was a rightful war against the hatred that the Nazis and fascists had. And one Russian writer, Yuri Bonarev, wrote in the New York Times, it was in 1974, that the Germans came with hatred towards our country, with arms to our country from fascist Germany, to destroy our state and our nation. And the nation pulled its human feelings, their call for home and mother and school, and their emotions or love of Russia together, and held up against this. This Vaslov, who left Russia at the time that the Tsars came in and formed the Vaslov Army, Lieutenant General Andrei Vaslov, was again fighting the Soviet Union and helping with arms against the war, World War II. He was later taken by the authorities and executed in 1946. The Soviet authorities got Lieutenant General Andrei Vaslov, the head of the Vaslov Army that had been arming since an early time to take over Russia for the Nazis, and he was executed in 1946. The chronology of 45 and 46 with the Howard Hughes industry was important too, because of what happens to Howard Hughes. He had already begun making contracts for the military during the war. Howard was making huge contracts. He started building his satellites for intelligence purposes in 1949 and manufacturing them for the CIA. By 43, he had gotten $70 million in government contracts. And Mr. Danner, who began working for Howard Hughes, soon for Intertel, for the Hughes Corporation, was in Florida as a campaign manager for George Smathers. That was the year that Smathers, in 1946, was to go to the House of Representatives from Florida, that Richard Nixon would go from California, and then Richard Nixon would meet Bebe Rebozo, a friend of Martha Mitchell, who later would marry John Mitchell. They would go, Richard Nixon, to Congress from California, and then Smathers would take him to Florida, where the long association with Bebe Rebozo began. Carl Boyer Public Relations Firm in 1947 began to take over the Howard Hughes empire, and that was the empire that had the Nazi connections. Boyer represented the Nazis as public relations firm, and under the guise of the Hughes empire, this large military Nazi compound was developing, and as I say, getting ready for the wars in Asia and soon in the Middle East. From 1945 to 1959, the presidents of the United States, Truman and Eisenhower, were totally controlled by John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. John Foster Dulles had a home next door to Charles Lindbergh at Long Island. Allen Dulles was working with the Nazis in Europe since the date that they lost in Stalingrad, and the arrangement to bring the Nazis was taking over, and these two men were perfectly suited to do it. one to head the CIA. Truman disbanded, dissolved the OSS October the 1st, 1945, and then in 1947 is the National Security Act, where we formulated this whole new body that would be arranging what they term national security, but which has really been the strangulation of this country. 1946 was when the wire services king, James Reagan, was murdered in Chicago. This is a can of worms that involved friends of Jack Ruby's in 46 and the Annenbergs and the ascendancy of the control over the wire services for organized crime. Admiral Byrd led a naval research team expedition down to Antarctica, where Adolf Hitler had already been there 1 year, and the last records of Admiral Byrd are locked up and were never seen in the National Archives. What he saw on that last trip has never yet been divulged. In 46, it seems that the aerospace industry and the military had escalated various people into very strategic roles into the House of Representatives, and they are still, some of them still hanging in there today, that would vote 1 year later for the National Security Council. It was important in those years to get those selected candidates into office, because then they in turn, as I say, would vote for the national security. Hale Boggs from the Warren Commission, he later was on the commission that covered up the murder of John Kennedy, was voted in 1946. Senator Russell, who was on the Warren Commission, was brought in 1946. Gerald Ford was brought to Congress in 1946. Ford and Boggs and Russell were on the Warren Commission. George Smathers, who was from Florida, close friend of Richard Nixon's, and the, as I say, the Rebozo gang down there, went into Congress in 1946 from Florida, and Richard Nixon went in 1946. Now, I haven't studied the total biography of the various people and their voting records, and somebody might look that up or do a research project if you have time and want to supply it for me, but it's interesting that Nixon, who was in Dallas the day Kennedy was killed and has been linked with those assassination teams and was the director for the Bay of Pigs operation and knew all of these operatives intimately, and Gerald Ford and Smathers and Russell, all members of the Warren Commission, Boggs, Russell, and Ford, Smathers, not on the Warren Commission, but a close friend of this gang, all came in 1946, and because that was such an important year for having men elected to Congress because they're to vote on the National Security Act, I wonder how many were handpicked for the express purpose of later being able to control the Congress and the military. General Patton at that time was dreaming of rearming a couple of what he called the Waffen SS divisions and incorporate them into the U.S. Army and lead them against the Reds. Later it came out that he was possibly murdered because he had information or was carrying gold out of Germany that belonged to the Nazis. So 46 was a terribly important year. The National Security Council was formed and became law in 1947. It took over all war-making decisions, literally from Congress. In other words, they advised the president on what is best for national security, and Congress then could begin to take orders instead of becoming fully informed themselves. They can be given disinformation, and the National Security Council had a 40 committee of dirty tricks. It actually was just a handful of people. They called it the 40 committee, a deception to make it look like it was a very broad discussion group, a handful of 5 people that could decide on assassination teams. And then behind the Marshall Plan was the same supposedly altruistic front, was the beginning of arming and funding for fascism around the world. After the youth organization began to escalate in the aerospace contracts, General Harold George, Wartime Air Transport Command, became the head of the Hughes aircraft, Hughes Electronic, after World War II. He was out with the Hughes aircraft, and then Howard Hughes had a near-fatal plane crash in 1946, just when all the aerospace contracts came to him, and Dr. Vern Mason came over and took care of him, and he recovered from the crash. It was almost fatal, but from that time on, there was suggestion that he had been drugged or under the control of various people who were later going to try to declare him incompetent and form the medical center a few years later, the Hughes Medical Center. Senator Joe McCarthy was in office in 1946, and he was to begin the Red Scare in the United States, a la Adolf Hitler, Shades of Hitler, with the Red List, the blacklisting in Hollywood, the scares in the State Department, and throughout the United States. McCarthy also was part of the 1946 Club. In 1946, there began to be a school for international business set in Glendale, Arizona, on an abandoned airfield set by Lieutenant General Barton Kyle Young. It was founded in 1946 for the express purpose of training Americans properly, in quotes, properly for overseas assignments. It was the American Institute for Foreign Trade. That's what the school was started and titled by, the American Institute for Foreign Trade. 8,000 graduates from 56 countries, and the enrollment was spread out of 87 people, and they were disseminated. The purpose of this school was to keep ahead of the times, which means kill labor, kill organizers, or democracies, get the fascism in. That was the purpose, to keep ahead of the times in terms of international economic situations and foreign relations. This preceded the Council of Foreign Relations. The tuition was $5,500, paid by corporations, sometimes by companies, and then these people were sent back to their various countries to work for the corporate interests in these countries, and the managers were sent from the United States. So instead of hiring natives, there was a time down in Panama where people working, Panamanians there, made 40 cents a day, and the Americans doing the identical job would come home with $5 a day. The purpose was for the corporations to be run by natives from their own hometowns or countries that were sent to the United States and were trained. Instead of having the bulks of natives, the management was trained by the corporations and then sent back there. This was in Glendale, Arizona in 1946, and the goal was to keep ahead of the economic situations there. It was founded by Lieutenant General Kyle, commander of the Air Corps during World War II. From 1946 to 1971, the United States spent $149 trillion in loans and grants to military dictatorships all over the world. 1 1/3 trillion since 1946 on military machines that were used for the whims of the generals. And after World War II, Allen Dulles wanted to give the French in Vietnam nuclear weapons. And after Stalin died, this was his chance, Allen Dulles said, to crowd the enemy and maybe finish him off once and for all. And General MacArthur was going to want to use atomic weapons over in that area in Southeast Asia, and that's when President Truman brought him home. He wanted sanctions for atomic war to wipe out Russia in 1946. In 1946, Kansas City became the training center for Saudi Arabian Airlines, and that's where TWA began training Arab pilots and getting their indoctrination into the American mechanics of the aircraft, arming the Middle East, which was totally Nazi and remained Nazi after World War II, and they could start getting their training in Kansas City. That started right after the war in 1946, and it was in 46 when General Patton was killed in an automobile accident. As I say, there were allegations that he knew of hoards of German gold or had German gold with him, and he had to be killed as he was taking it out of Germany. The campaigns for Congress of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, of course, were anti-communist campaigns. 1947 was the year that Richard Nixon, a member of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, bailed out Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby was in some kind of a jam or fix, and he was working for Richard Nixon at that time, and I imagine, looking back, that it had something to do with the Reagan murder or the Annenberg situation, and Ruby was in trouble, and so were Nixon's friends, and Richard Nixon, as a member of the House Committee on Un-American Activities, had bailed out Jack Ruby. In 1947, Paraguay was taken over by General Alfred Stroessner. written up in the book The State of Siege, another Nazi dictator. And in 1947 at Annapolis, there was L. Patrick Gray, Gray went from Annapolis to National Security Council to working with Richard Nixon's team and the CIA through from the time he was out through the hierarchies of the government. And when J. Edgar Hoover was murdered in May of '72, L. Patrick Gray was acting director of the FBI at the time of Watergate. He was caught deep-sixing valuable evidence at a criminal trial when people had been arrested, and I'd published articles that Gray had been destroying evidence of crimes right up to the point where they were considering his appointment involving ITT, collusion, and criminal behavior, and also riots in California that the Reichstag had set up at the Isla Vista. They were called the Isla Vista riots, University of California in Santa Barbara. Gray had put the lid on counterintelligence activities in the Los Angeles western section, and he had moved himself up from Annapolis. Also, the class of '47 was Stansfield Turner, now director of the CIA, a roommate in college of William Webster, who's director of the FBI, and Jimmy Carter, the atomic expert from Annapolis, who then went on to become president of the United States. So the Congress was stacked. I just mentioned a few people from the Warren Commission who came in '46 and voted for the National Security Council in '47. And Annapolis was stacked with a group that were going to converge historically later that were located in those places at the time. In '47, John Stennis went on to the Senate, to the House Armed Services Committee, where he held important jobs. And then, of course, there was the Red Scare with Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers, who worked for Henry Luce and Time magazine. And Alger Hiss was to bring down the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, the United Nations, the peace agreements, because he was included in all of them, and the Carnegie Foundation. They were manipulating him around, Alan Dulles was, and giving him key jobs so that they could pull the rug under. And the German that he had met years earlier, Whittaker Chambers, had used an alias and another name, and the thing that brought Alger Hiss down in the height of the Red Scare that made Richard Nixon's ascendancy go up as a great commie fighter was the Henry Luce Whittaker Chambers person, and Whittaker Chambers had links to George de Mohrenschildt. If these three tapes aren't confusing you sufficiently, de Mohrenschildt and Whittaker Chambers knew and worked together, and also people from Hughes Aircraft with Whittaker Chambers, and de Mohrenschildt again goes back to the Auchincloss family and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis' family and the Nazi Gehlen operations. I'm just giving you some rundowns of important dates and people pretty fast, and I just hope it's not going too fast for you and that it's making some sense, but these names interweave, and I'm trying to show you some of the names that have gone in and out like a ballet through the past years. The National Security Council, after it was formed, took over from, as I say, from the Congress, major decisions, and has been a divided chapter of American history ever since it was formed. And of course then we got Germans like Henry Kissinger and Polish czars like Mr. Brzezinski to direct the Americans on what's good for us as our country gets depleted economically, socially, psychologically, with their assassination teams and corruption of the economy and manipulation of us, so that we're totally bankrupt, and the only thing going is gold, and the American dollar sinks down, and America will be about where they wanted us in 1934 with the plot to seize the White House. In 1947 in Tacoma, Washington, was the first mention of something that was being built by the Nazis for 20 years, which was UFO planes before the war was over, and they had taken the UFOs down to the Antarctica to continue building with the American military machine. And one of the first men to talk about UFOs was in Tacoma, Washington, a man named Fred Crisman. He also used an alias by the name of Gold, and many people believe it's Fred Crisman's picture that is with the tramps in Dealey Plaza. He worked with Clay, Shaw, and Permindex, and he serviced in Tacoma, Washington, and said that the UFO men in black had visited him. And if you follow my tapes on Alternative 3 or the last few, I've mentioned a book that's available on the men in black. And it's interesting that a man from the Defense Intelligence Agency and the CIA, Fred Crisman, should be one of the first American figures to speak of visiting the UFOs and the men in black. And that was up in Tacoma, Washington in 1947. In 1947, the United States government started breaking characters of American citizens into various codes. They classified them and graded them. It was called the SPN program, the Separation Program Number. And it was a coding. They had 530 grades that began. It started with veterans of the war, and this is the continuation of the Interpol figures that could be in the Mormon data banks on us today. It was started right after the war when the National Security Council was secure. Veterans, they marked whether they were disloyal or subversive, if they received anti-war literature in the mail, and there were 530 code listings to separate people that would go into the Defense Department and later can be fed into the computers. And they were distributed to every large corporation in America. How veterans or people who were in the war were being coded and graded, and they were tagged marginal, producer, unsuitable, apathy, defensive attitudes, unsanitary habits, sexual deviants, homosexuals, debts, failure to pay debts. And that spy system goes back to 1947, whether they received anti-war literature in the mail, just as in 1940 Franklin Roosevelt was working with J. Edgar Hoover to open telegrams and list people who were antagonistic to the pro-Hitler statements of Charles Lindbergh, who was working with Goebbels and Goering up to and through the war and had Nazi feelings after the war. He wrote that by Hitler losing the war, the Western world lost thousands of years of mongrelization of the races. So the loyalty, the subversion, went out to public utilities and public corporations. So if you wonder why they're all white and sanitized and very sterile and clean, your corporation heads, this is part of the reason why people are excluded. It began in 1947. In 1947 began Operation Chatter. That was the Pentagon beginning their drug testing. The excuse was to find out how much people can talk under pressure. But of course, it meant more, because after World War II, many people would want a better world and want to begin to change the world. So it was very important to have the medications and the drugs and the assassination team set up to kill any leaders and to check their minds and have a control, a handle on their minds. Getting back to the first tape, the discoveries of Freud and Jung were to be used against the people and elicit information from them and find out who's the cause or the main part of the organizing of each labor or radical who was labeled the blacks, the Indians, the farm workers, and then it goes into the student union protests, the anti-war protesters, the lesbians, the gays. They had them all tagged, and this method of making people talk was beginning to be perfected in 47 so that they could put a tag on the leaders. 1947 was the year of Project Shamrock. That's the global communication system that was set up by Harry Truman and his advisors. Firms such as RCA, ITT, World Communications, Western Union International, and so forth began clandestine use of telegrams, and they targeted various people for investigation by the U.S. intelligence system. That was set up by the National Security Agency, Operation Shamrock, and that's when our privacy really ended. In 1934, they were violating the Communications Act and the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. The project allegedly was halted in 1975, but I doubt if they would give up anything that good. In 1947, Richard Nixon was a member of the House Un-American Activity. He was elected to the House of Representatives, and he also had bailed out Jack Ruby that year, who was in a jam. And Jack Ruby was working for Richard Nixon in terms of some testimony in Chicago, and he had bailed him out. Later, when Jack Ruby wiped out Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas, and erased the conspiratorial links to the assassination of John Kennedy, then Richard Nixon was able to become President of the United States with the Kennedys, two Kennedys out of the way. In 1947, in Paraguay, General Alfred Stroessner, with his German background, formed a state of siege, a dictatorship in Paraguay, General Somoza is living with him at the present time. After he was kicked out of Nicaragua, Somoza moved down to Paraguay. In 1947, L. Patrick Gray was at Annapolis. He graduated from Annapolis and went on to work for the National Security Council and for Richard Nixon, and was acting director of the FBI at the time of Watergate and deep-sixed important information that would have linked the Nixon-Watergate era to the Kennedy assassination. In the same class was Stansfield Turner, who went on to become head of the Central Intelligence Agency. Turner was appointed by another classmate, Jimmy Carter. The three of them were at Annapolis, 1947. L. Patrick Gray, Stansfield Turner, and Jimmy Carter, all concealing the assassinations and conspiracies and covering for each other. The Soviet Union exploded their first atomic bomb in that year, and important events around the world were taking place. Also, Gerald Ford was sent to the House of Representatives the same time that Richard Nixon was sent, one from Michigan, one from California, and they would have a very close relationship through the years, first with Richard Nixon appointing Gerald Ford to the Warren Commission to cover up the links of the murder of John Kennedy, and later Richard Nixon appointing Gerald Ford to become President of the United States to cover up Nixon's links in the Watergate going back to the Kennedy assassination. The Red Scare escalated as soon as people like Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford were in the House of Representatives. Those were important elections in '46, and Alger Hiss was framed by Whittaker Chambers, and they tried to link it to a communist link. That was the year of the famous pumpkin papers, a Henry Luce invention. 1947 was the first discussion, or one of the first in this country, about the UFO and those mysterious men in black. It involved Fred Crisman, a gentleman from the Central Intelligence Agency who was also filmed at Dealey Plaza when Kennedy was killed. He was a CIA employee. He worked with Clay Shaw in the Nazi connections in the Trade Mart in New Orleans. He was a friend of Clay Shaw's, and he was linking the UFOs to these men in black very early. He was one of the first men to talk about it, and since then there's been a lot of discussion of those UFOs actually being Nazi invented weapons that are coming out of Antarctica and the South Pole. In 1947, the government started breaking your character record down into codes, whether veterans were loyal or disloyal or subversive, whether they got anti-war literature in the mail. They separated them into various departments, their habits, their sex habits, their debts, failure to pay debts, and they were labeled. This classifying was called the SPN, Separation Program Number. There were codings, 530 grades that you gave, and then these facts could be put on file and sent out to corporations and public utilities and go into the Mormon data banks or the caves in Utah and be salted away for Intertel or other political purposes later. Everybody was tagged. 1947 was really the escalation of the Cold War strategy. The CIA began to build up the docks in Marseille that were notorious for narcotics traffic. They began to unload cargo in France. It was part of what was to be the Marshall Plan to build up Europe, and we gave over $250 million towards international affairs. It came from major private institutions in this country and from the government, and our connections to the Marseille narcotics flow and Interpol that moved from Vienna to France later became part and parcel of the Nazi drug connections. It does very little to find criminals, but it's for narcotics traffic. In June 18, 1948, was started the Office of Special Projects. That's when the Cold War between the United States and Russia really got going. The National Security Council took covert activity against the Soviet Union, and the excuse was the international interest of world peace and national security, and the government must go into covert operations. In 1947 was Operation Chatter. That was the program to keep agents from talking or giving information away. 1948, Israel became a country, and in May of 48, and within a few months, the top leading Nazis, 50 of the major war criminals from Latin and South America were sent to Egypt to Mr. Nasser to begin the project of dissolving Israel, which is taking place right now in front of our eyes. In 1948, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated. There were other assassination attempts on Walter Reuther. One of them took place later. Operation Ohio was a CIA program responsible for 100 European assassinations through the next 10 years. It came out of Columbus, Ohio, and was linked to Permindex and Division 5 of the FBI, described in the Torbett document. Starting in 1948, after World War II, the Nazis came to this country, campuses, institutions, State Department, Central Intelligence Agency, to make and pattern the United States government similar to Nazi Germany. My time is out on this tape. I'll continue with the chronology in a few more weeks. I'll take a break to update the news and then get back to the chronology.